Hi, everybody. Normally, I do this in groups of, say, 10 to 25 at a time, so this is a little different. Let me flip over really quick to something other than the ad. Everybody able to see that? Good. All right, so really quickly, a little bit of intro. Eric was asking earlier, so how do you want me to describe like what you do and who you do it for and things like that? And I said, I'd really rather you just stick with what you personally know about me, and then I'll do the intro. So Eric left out part of the origin story, which is, a few weeks, months ahead of the coming out party for Stack Blitz. You and I met in California, and I told him he was doing everything wrong in his life. Apparently I was wrong. He seems to be doing okay. All right, so what is it that I do with most of my free time? Well, if I look familiar, it may be because of this. Anybody ever seen this website? Yes, thank you, Lance. Also an instructor for Angular Bootcamp, so yeah. If you look very, very closely back there, you can see me. There I am, look at that. The nice people who run Angular Bootcamp are Oasis Digital. You've probably seen the sponsor booth out there. And they did that without telling me that I was going to be the face, the international model for Angular Bootcamp. And it does cause some interesting interactions in the hallways because people often know me and have no idea why. They're like, I Googled Angular one time and that face followed me all over the web. So yes, if you have searched for Angular, I've probably shown up in a picture in your browser. Hopefully not adjacent to anything terribly embarrassing. So a little bit of a background here. I'm primarily known these days anyway for Angular development, Angular training. So I split my time between being this guy, doing Angular training, but also being a working, consultant, technical architect, guy who writes software for big companies. So doing the work that a lot of the folks in the room, I'm sure, also do. So why am I giving a talk primarily about CSS? Well, a couple of years ago, with the nice folks at Oasis Digital, I ended up on a project that was kind of this dream combination of factors. All of us who've been doing this for a while, you've had the same problem over and over again, undoubtedly. It's like, we need you to do the impossible, and it has to work in IE6. All the gray came from somewhere. But this project was a little bit weird. I'm the guy kind of brokering the deal, talking with the client liaison, and I'm like, all right, I need to understand the basic requirements of your application. First of all, what browsers do you need to support? And the answer was, and I'm not joking, it's going to take us, about a year to put this together? I'm like, yeah, probably so. This is a really big project. He's like, whatever version of Chrome is current then? I'm like, He's like, yeah, whatever the latest version of Chrome is at the time the thing actually goes to production, it's cool. That's the only one we need to support. So whatever you think Chrome will be capable of in 2018, we're good. I'm like, I love you. You are the best client ever. And they haven't gone back on it. They've actually stuck with that. So an interesting thing happened because of that particular requirement or lack of a requirement. We were able to live in the future. There was no, make sure it works in IE9. It wasn't even to make sure it works in IE11. It wasn't even to make sure it works in Edge. It was Chrome from the future. As long as you have that, we're good. All right, second part of the origin story. Why I'm here in front of you talking about CSS. One of the least favorite things to me about web development, even modern web development, has always been the lack of a good layout system. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go way back in time to the very early days of the web, probably quite literally earlier than some of you were alive, we had things like this creating killer websites. Anybody here ever heard of David Siegel and High Five and creating killer websites? I'm seeing nothing but blank stares. That does not surprise me. But at the time, we're talking 1995 or thereabouts, when the web was really becoming the web, something for people other than physicists and nerds to use. You had things like creating killer websites and High Five websites, and this is the dude that created and or popularized two very, very popular techniques at the time. One of them was table-based layouts, as in table tags and TRs and TDs. Who here has done table-based layout in their application? Okay, finally. See, I'm getting to the point where it's relevant in your life. Who here loves table-based layout? Nobody raise your hand. But even before that, we had, see, I should have it pulled up here. We had pixel shims. Anybody remember spacer GIFs? 1x1 invisible GIFs. And the reason that we had them was so we could move crap around on the page. It's amazing anything ever worked at all. But we did this, and we did this for a long time. David Siegel, the killer websites guy, he was one of the folks who either created or popularized this technique. And I built a bunch of websites this way. But I never liked it. No right-thinking person ever did. It was one of those things where we don't have anything better, so this is what we're going to have to do with ourselves. And it was awful. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but you need to understand the way that it worked was by you actually having small GIFs or GIFs, I don't care, that let you put space on either side of them with like H space and V space attributes so that you could literally move things to a particular place on a web page. And if this sounds absolutely bonkers, you are not wrong. But then a wonderful thing happened. Internet Explorer 3. Everybody's like, what? Internet Explorer 3 is the first place anyway that I encountered CSS, cascading style sheets, and it was the thing that would save us all. It didn't, but it was supposed to be the thing that would save us all. It finally let us start going toward the true promise of the original web, which was just give us content. Mark it up with things like paragraph tags and H1s and H2s, and just let it be what it is. And somewhere else, some other magical place, we're going to put the styling information. And that was CSS. So no longer did we have things like font tags to worry about, or the blink tag. We were able to have true semantic HTML and style all that stuff in some other place. Put all that cosmetics, aesthetics, all that stuff somewhere else. And while it didn't really work entirely the way that we wanted to, it was at least a giant step in the right direction. But one of the things that was missing, and continued to be missing until literally just a couple of years ago, was a true layout system. Now, a lot of people in the room, if you've got any familiarity with the ways that we've done layout in HTML, CSS, in other words, the way we've made the browser show what we want to show the way we want to show it, you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute. We've had things like Bootstrap and Foundation and lots of other CSS frameworks. They were clearly able to do some sort of layout for us. We had Flexbox. We even had tables. They were awful, but they worked. In fact, there was a time when CSS wasn't doing what it was supposed to do, and we had websites like giveupandusetables.com. Don't go there. It's not what it used to be. So this is on archive.org. And if you read it, it's fantastic. It's like, we've all been there. We want to make it work with CSS. So here is a timer you can use as you struggle with CSS. And when you finally get frustrated, you're officially allowed to stop, give up, and use tables. I sent this to a lot of clients. Times are different now. Times have changed, and they are so much better than they used to be. A couple of years ago, after Flexbox had become a thing that people could use and liked, and I love Flexbox, don't get me wrong. This is not a bash Flexbox session. But after Flexbox had become a thing and people realized, wow, this is an improvement, but it is not everything that we needed, CSS Grid came along. And one of the wonderful things about CSS Grid is the way that it was deployed to evergreen browsers. So within the space of about a month, Chrome, Firefox, and Edge, and all the mobile browsers gained CSS Grid capabilities. And that was early 2017, first quarter of 2017. And it happened pretty much simultaneously across all these browsers. So like I said, they learned some things from the Flexbox rollout a few years earlier, where it had been a very staggered release. Individual browsers had gotten it at different times, and some of those browsers had gotten one version, and some gotten a slightly different version. In fact, we still see holdovers of that today. as we have libraries that live on top of our Flex implementations and tools like Auto Prefixer in order to make Flex really look the same across all the browsers. And again, I'm not bashing on Flex. It's just they kind of botched the rollout a little bit. And even the people who did it, they're like, yeah, we should have done a better job of that. And they did with CSS Grid. With Grid, in the space of a month, early 2017, everybody got the same grid. More to the point, for the previous 4 or so years, Grid had already existed behind a feature flag or behind some sort of flag inside the browser that said, you know, if you want to try this, you can turn it on, but you have to turn it on in order to be able to play with it. And people did. For years, they really hammered on Grid, which meant that when it really got turned on for all of us to use in production websites for real clients, it worked. And it worked really, really well. So all this lined up very, very nicely with my magical dream client that's like, just use whatever's current. Grid showed up at the point that I needed it most in my life, and I fell in love. Hence, the name of the talk. Because for the first time, in a browser, you can do true layout, no hacking, 2 dimensions, rows and columns, without having a bunch of extra stuff polluting your markup. So what we're going to do in this particular presentation, this set of workshops, is we're going to go through what Grid looks like, what it actually takes to use it, what it is to use it well, and then a lot of examples that are going to build up from kind of small ideas to bigger and more complicated things that will be closer to what you would use in a real application. But before we jump into that, I've asked a few questions about who has used what in the past. Who here has used CSS Grid already? How do you feel about it? Be honest. Because one of the things that I have found is that people often encounter Grid, and they have people like me going, it's the greatest thing ever, it's finally arrived. And they get into it, and about 20 minutes later, they're like, I don't get it. I don't get what the big excitement was. This seems really painful. This seems complicated. I know Flex. I had to learn Flex and all of its weirdness. I'm good. I don't need another thing that seems to cover a lot of the same territory as Flex, but with a different syntax. And also, it feels a lot like table layout, but without the table markup. And although people present that as an advantage, sometimes that feels a little bit weird. You're like, I'm having to detach these 2 important ideas, like my markup and the layout for my markup, and I don't quite know how to reconnect these dots. We're going to solve that problem in this talk. All right, so before I jump into the next section, there's the thing I want you to do. I'm going to want you to go to GitHub, and I'm going to preemptively apologize because I realized after I did this, I included like 100 megabytes of images, so good luck, internet. On my GitHub, there should be a thing under the repositories called Spacewalk, if I can find it. I promise it's out there. Oh, it would help if I made it public. I apologize. One moment, please. You guys get to see the big warning that says, are you really sure you want to do this? There's probably all sorts of stuff in there you don't ever want to give away. Sure. And settings, there we go. Make this repository public. Oh, dear God, are you sure? Type the name of the repository. Yes, I'm totally sure. Oh, God. Worked on my machine. The really cool thing is Eric's sitting in the front row, so when this inevitably has trouble with stack blitz, I'm like, Eric. Okay, now, there should be, on my GitHub, a thing that you can get to called Spacewalk. And that's the application that I'm going to be using to demonstrate all this stuff and to do the workshops. Now, this application is a big Angular app, and all of the examples are components within this Angular application. Now, I've done this quite deliberately. So, first of all, go there, clone this repo. It's an Angular CLI project, npm install, and then wait. But go ahead and get that running, and we'll see how we do. It's going to pull down not only the code for this, but the typical 700 gigabytes of dependencies. And then once it's up, and once that's done, you should be able to npm start and see exactly what you're seeing on my screen. All right, so this application is built in kind of a weird way. I have deliberately made it so there is no sort of application shell. In other words, if I go to like this menu, which we're going to see a lot of in here, notice there's no header at the top that says, oh, click here to go back to the home page. There's no footer at the bottom. And the reason that I did that is because I want every one of these individual examples to be something that could effectively stand alone. Which means the CSS that you're going to see, while it's all real and while it all works, is sometimes like going to be duplicated across a lot of different examples. In a real application, I would extract all that stuff to some sort of set of global styles and a bunch of CSS properties. But I've deliberately kept each one of these examples as something that you could effectively pick up and extract to its own thing and use independently. And hopefully that'll make it easier for you not to have to look in 17 different places to see what it is that I'm actually trying to accomplish there. Now, since I don't have a header and I don't have any place that I can easily click to go anywhere, there are some keystrokes that I put in place. What's the old joke about, any real application over time eventually grows to the ability to like send email? Well, anytime you're trying to avoid using a slide package in a presentation, you gradually build most of a slide package in your presentation. That's what I've done here. I have a keystroke that will take me to this menu. I have another keystroke that'll take me back to the welcome screen. I have keystrokes that will take me across different examples. You'll see those in the code for the root component if you really want to see them. It's backslash, it's backtick, and it's the square brackets if you want to move around the same way that I'm moving around. But I'm explaining all this to you not because it's super important to understand about CSS Grid, but so that you'll understand kind of the weird structure of this particular application. It's done that way deliberately so that we'll have all of the space to play with on each individual page. I'm going to go a little bit more into the structure of the application in just a second, but I wanted you to understand that. So anybody that actually is fortunate enough to get the whole damn thing downloaded and get it running, you'll understand how to move around inside of it. All right, other things about this particular application. Like I said, it's an Angular app because this is a combination of Angular and CSS Grid things, but I'm going to be really upfront with you. This is mostly about CSS Grid. I want the techniques that we talk about here today to be something that you can pick up and use in any web application, in any web document for that matter. In fact, several of the examples that we have are really going to be more document-oriented just to explain some of these important CSS Grid techniques without all of the superstructure of an application wrapped around it. I'm not going to shy away from using Angular when it makes sense. So for example, in some of these things here, like these divs, I don't literally have 9 divs on a page. I use our friend ng-conf to generate a bunch of divs. But apart from that, not super complicated Angular code in here. That's the idea. Okay, how are we doing on the download? Dare I even ask? 71%? That's 2 digits. That's more than I was expecting by this point, frankly, so I'll take it. All right. So here in our main menu, we've got lots of different examples that are deliberately named so as not to give things away. Feel free to poke around on the source code if you want to, but otherwise I can unfold them as we go. First thing I want to show you is deliberately called the best feature ever. So what do you think I'm demonstrating here on this page? Centering. Oh my God, we can finally center things without a whole lot of pain and anguish in HTML. And yes, I am making a joke, but not really. It was really, really hard to center things for a long time. And not only are we centering something horizontally, we're centering things vertically. So if I come in here and I grab the corner, I can actually keep this thing really centered wherever I happen to be on this particular page. The satellite, by the way, is the thing I'm centering. The planet in the background, it's staying right where it's supposed to be. So let's take a look at some code. Just kind of set the tone here. By the way, I'm a Vim user. You don't have to be a Vim user to be a CSS Grid unless you want to be a good person. Okay. All right. So way down in here, you get an overview of the structure of the code. We're going to be jumping around in all these examples. There's a handful of additional components that we're using. We have that menu that I talked about just a moment ago. So, here is our app.component.html, which we're going to route to individual things. So this is a pretty standard Angular application from the perspective of Angular code. The only thing that's really weird is, again, us taking over the entire viewport for the individual examples. You'll see lots and lots of this application as you go, and it will not, there's nothing in here that will be surprising, deliberately so. All right, so we were talking about centering. Well, that's our example for centering. In fact, you can see, if you look in the route, that the route name and the component name that we're looking at are always going to match up. That'll make it really, really easy for you to follow on the code. So here's what it takes to do this. First of all, the Angular component itself couldn't be simpler. Well, technically it could. I could get rid of that static label. But other than that, it is a really, really simple Angular component. We're basically just using it for its template. Here's the whole template. Literally just an image and nothing else. And just so you're really clear about this, I'm not doing anything outside of this component that would center this thing on the page. All of the centering is happening here in this CSS. The only really important parts in here are the display grid. Let me bump this up so you can see it. Deliberately setting the height of this to be 100% of the viewport height. If you haven't seen viewport units before, you're going to love them. They're awesome. And then this thing. Place items : center. It's a little shorthand that says, I would like it to be horizontally and vertically centered, please. In whatever container I happen to be in, put it right in the middle. I can specify those separately if I want to with align items and justify items. People are always like, which one is which? I can never remember. If you can remember how to use a word processor, and you remember what the justify button does, lets you justify right, justify left, justify center, that's what justify items does for you inside of a grid context, which is what we've done. We've said we want to be display grid, and we want to place items in the center, which means align and justify the items right in the middle. Now again, I'm kind of making a joke here because centering has been a pain for a long, long time. But this is super useful to know, and it begins to give us a little bit of a clue as to how CSS Grid actually works. You've probably seen lots of display : something in CSS before. The most common ones by far are block and inline. And if you think about them as like what div does and what span does, that's block and inline. Display grid is a new one of these things. And there's lots of them, but display grid is the one that we're going to see most often today. And it says, I want the stuff inside of this particular thing to be displayed as a grid. Now, what is this particular thing? This part might be a little bit surprising. :host. I don't know how familiar people are with Angular's view encapsulation. Frankly, one of the most wonderful features of Angular that you get for free, right out of the box. :host is a way of saying, I'm inside of an element, one of those fake elements that we use in order to create components. I want to reach outside and grab a hold of that element and style some stuff about it. I see, again, I teach Angular Bootcamp. I see people all the time, the very first thing they do inside of one of their custom components is they put a div. Because they're like, oh, I'm going to need a div to hold all the stuff together inside. You already have one of those things to hold the stuff together. It is the element that you created via the selector. So we have an element. It's the example centering element. If we look inside of the DOM, just take a look at this guy. You'll actually be able to see there's our example centering element right underneath the router outlet. So there's no need for an extra div. But sometimes you want that extra div or the equivalent of that extra div in order to be able to style the thing that you're sitting inside of. And that's exactly what :host does for you. So if we come in here and look, you can see we've said that we would like our Angular element to be display grid. This alone is going to save you a tag on every element that you create from this, every component that you create from this point forward. And then furthermore, not only do we want it to be display grid, we want it to take up 100% of the viewport height. We want the whole thing. I could change this if I want. If I said, this really needs to only be 70% of the viewport height. After Angular recompiles all my code, we end up with 70% of the viewport height. Now, I could furthermore move that around as well if I wanted to with other centering and alignment commands, but I'm just kind of showing off what viewport units are doing for you in combination with display : grid. And notice, we're still dead in the center of the thing that we said now only takes up 70% of the height of the viewport. So far, so good. What else have we got going on in here? Everything else is just sizzle. I'm going to put this back to 100. I've said that I want my background image to look like a planet. This has nothing to do with grid, but it gives you some cool CSS stuff to take home and show off. We've said that we want a radial gradient. It's going to be circular, and it's going to go through several different colors in order to make it look like it's actually a planet. And then behind the whole thing, there's going to be a star field. That's where we get the star field and the thing that looks like a planet. So the only thing that's on this page that's an HTML element is the image. And it's all happening inside of our example centering component. So you get the idea so far? Anything completely bizarre and broken that you don't get? How are we doing on the download? Anybody still working on it? I heard something. 90%. Oh. We gave people false hope, and then they took advantage of it, and now we wait. All right. But it's still moving, right? Okay, cool. Hey, Eric, someone should try to see if that repo works on Stackblitz. It does not. Okay. No errors in my console. Must be Stackblitz's fault. Remember, I'm wise. You can't argue. All right. So now that we've learned how to center, and along the way of learning how to center, we've learned a little bit about how we have to turn on grid. Let's make things a little more complicated. Notice in here, all we did was say display grid. We didn't define any rows or columns or grid template anything. We didn't define anything except the display. We said we want this thing to be grid. And that already gave us some superpowers, the ability to position things horizontally and vertically right in the center of the component. But let's make it a little more exciting. So if I use my backslash to go back here, I'm actually going to skip briefly over the sum assembly required because I want to use that one as a source for a workshop, and go to playing with blocks. And before I move on, I should mention, there's a good chance we're not going to get through all this stuff. And I made a command decision that we make in our classes as well. I'd rather leave you with more than we have time for than artificially end early. So if I skip around, don't be surprised. If I skip over entirely, don't be surprised either. I want to use the 2 hours effectively, but that may mean we don't get to everything. And that's totally cool. You can take it home and play with it. All right, so playing with blocks. This is actually taking more advantage of grid than we were before. I can tell you this is 9 divs with a little bit of styling in order to make them show up on the page. And the code is not super complicated. Here in our example blocks, again, pretty simple component. Let me back off a little so you can see the whole thing. The only complicated bit is that we're building an array of labels. So I'm deliberately saying, give me a string array, and then long as we've got less than 10 of these things, push the number as a string onto this array of labels. So we end up with the string 1, the string 2, the string 3. And then we immediately turn around and use that in our template. So again, this is about the most complicated Angular you're going to see in here. But hopefully it all makes sense. We're saying, give us one div for every one of the labels inside that array of labels, and then set the title of that div to whatever the label is that we generated. Title is not an Angular thing. Title's built into HTML. Nobody ever really knows what to do with it. So I'm like, great, that's exactly what I need. I'm going to stick it on each one of these divs. And then you can see the label inside the div itself. You can probably see how this is already shaping up. Each one of these divs now has a 1, a 2, a 3, et cetera inside of it. Makes it really easy to see where they are on the page. But the real magic is happening inside the CSS. Like I said, a lot more going on. So using that :host selector, so that we don't have to have like a wrapper div around the whole thing, we can simply say, grab the element that I'm sitting inside of, and make it display grid. Also give it a little bit of padding, because if I didn't have that padding, remember I said every one of these individual examples is deliberately completely stark. There's almost no extra styling that we don't need, so everything's quite plain, including padding, including margins. And the reason that I do that is going to become a lot clearer later when I start taking over the entire viewport. So I don't want there to be any externally applied styling that says, oh, put something in the middle of the screen, or put margins around it. I really want every one of my individual examples to be able to take over the entire page, the entire screen. But in this particular example, I did want there to be a little bit of breathing room around it. So now I've got an element that's display grid. It's got a little bit of padding around it, but I'm beginning to take advantage of some of the things I can define about a grid. I've said that this particular grid is going to have 5 100-pixel columns. I could have done it like this. 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels, but life is way too short. So instead, Grid gives us this really handy repeat CSS function. Can you guess what it does? 5 times, give me 100 pixels. This doesn't exist currently outside of Grid, but it's so handy that expect it to start being in other parts of CSS. One of the cool things about Grid and Flex before it is they both brought so many nifty things into CSS that it turns out would be really useful in other parts of CSS that they're gradually leaking out of CSS Grid and Flexbox. Repeat's one of those things that you're probably going to see over the next couple of years begin to show up in other places. All right, so we've said we want 5 columns, and we also want 5 rows. Now that's a little bit surprising because we don't have 5 rows, but that's fine. Just because we don't happen to have enough elements to fill up 5 rows doesn't mean we can't have 5 rows of the grid available to us if we need it. In fact, if I came in here and went back to my TypeScript and really wanted to get crazy and say, give me up to 20. And I come back here and wait forever, and eventually, look at that. As I add more divs, the grid just keeps working. So I've got 5 by 5 available to me, and I've filled up 19 of those available slots out of the 25. So far, so good. Continuing on, everything else in here is mostly cosmetic. But if you notice, there is one cool thing. Each one of the divs is also marked display grid. Why? Because I wanted to be able to center my number. That's all I really did. There is no additional rows, columns, anything inside here. I just wanted to make sure my number would show up in the center. So I said display grid just for the ability to get the 1 in the middle and the 17 in the middle. And that's totally fine. The cool thing about it is it shows you that it's perfectly okay, in fact, strongly encouraged for you to nest CSS Grid arbitrarily. Now, those of you who are old Bootstrap jockeys the way that I am, you can probably remember how much fun it was to try to nest Bootstrap layouts within each other. You could sort of make it work, but don't breathe on it. Don't get too close. It always felt like, those old speakers that if you get really close to them, they go, that's what a Bootstrap nested layout always felt like to me. It's like, as long as I don't look too closely, it'll be fine. That is not a thing you have to worry about in CSS Grid at all. CSS Grid, you can have grids inside of grids inside of grids all the way down. And that's exactly all we're doing here. We're saying we've got a main grid that lays out our overall view, and then inside of it, lots of little grids. So here on this screen, we've got 20 grids going on. The main grid that holds all of them, and the 19 individual grids for the divs. That alone is pretty handy. And they could get as complicated as we want internally. There's no limitation like, well, if you've defined rows and columns outside, you can't define rows and columns inside. Nope, you're totally able to do that. And we'll see examples of that later on. Everything else, cosmetics. Want to make the font slightly bigger. Want to make it have a green border. Want to make rounded corners because we live in the post-jobs era and nothing can have square corners anymore. Everything else in here is just aesthetics. If I took it away, in fact, I'll take away this part as well. I'll just leave the border so you can actually see the divs themselves. It all still works. Everything's great. It does lead to an interesting question, though. Kind of like, tree falls in the forest, no one's there to hear it, doesn't make any sound. If you define a grid and you don't put anything in it, what does it look like? What do you think it looks like? Let's find out. Now my template is completely empty, and wait for the magic to happen. Keep waiting. Nothing. Why would I bother showing you this? Of course there's nothing there. It's actually an important but subtle point. Grid is not an HTML construct. Grid doesn't really exist in HTML. It's there like a force field that has no visual representation. In fact, even though grid is a thing that occurs inside of CSS, there are no styling rules for grids. You can't put a border on a grid. You can't say, I would like to style the gap between elements in a certain way. This leads to lots of frustration. People would really like to be able to do this. And I kind of expect that eventually it will show up. But as of today, grids themselves have no appearance until you start putting things inside of them. And at this point anyway, that's a feature, not a bug. So if you ever find yourself going, well, I don't see my grid. Well, yeah, you don't see the grid. You see the things in the grid. When you put them in place, that's when the grid begins to show up. But there's a trick. If we go in here and inspect this guy, take a look at the elements, you'll actually be able to see we do have our example blocks element, and as soon as I hover over to the DevTools, sure enough, there is a grid there. It's just waiting for elements to be inside of it. Now I'm in the Chrome DevTools to be able to see this, and you get the basic structure inside the Chrome DevTools. Now we can actually see all 25 of the places that we could put something. But we don't have a lot of other information. Chrome is coming along in terms of its grid capabilities, its grid tooling, but it's not nearly as far along as Firefox is. So I'm going to take this example that we've got, flip over to Firefox, and visit our playing with blocks example again. And now I can hover over this and see much the same thing that we saw just a moment ago. I don't have enough screen space. Can you tell I'm not on my big monitor at home? There's my example blocks, but I don't really see much going on in Firefox. Well, Bill, you just lied to us. You said Firefox was really cool when it came to grid help, but it looked better in Chrome. Well, you can ask for more help. If you look down here, we got a little grid panel. Firefox has a dedicated grid panel where you can say, I want to turn on an overlay for that grid. In fact, I want to turn it on and I want to make sure I can really see it, so I'm going to turn on the lines so it's very, very visible. So now not only do I get an overview of the grid, but I get numbers for all of those things as well. So the topmost line is number 1. If I zoom in a bit, you can actually see there's my 1, 2, 3, 4, and it goes down as well. 1, 2, 3, etc. I got lots of things that I can turn on. If I wanted to, if I had area names, which we haven't talked about yet, I could turn those on. I could extend the lines out infinitely. So if I had a grid that was like partially off screen or even entirely off screen, I could say, extend the line so I can actually see where the grid would be if I could see it off the screen. Great tools, and you really, really should get used to them. This gave me a reason, even before Firefox completely redid their engine and got really fast and relevant again, this gave me a reason to go back to Firefox and keep Firefox as one of the main tools in my development arsenal that Chrome had kind of, taken over. So make sure that you grab the latest version of Firefox and get really used to the grid tooling because it will help you a lot. We'll see a little bit more of this later on. All right. So let's put some stuff back in this grid. We'll just undo our way back there. So this is cool. Tells us a lot about what we've got, but I don't know about you, but not many of my applications consist of 19 evenly spaced blocks that all look the same. I want to be able to do more than this. So before we move on, give me a download check. How are we doing? Is it working? Yes. If only I thought to bring a prize. Sorry. Anybody that's still working on it, hopefully it's still progressing, because we're going to get to a workshop in just a second. I want you to be able to do it locally. All right, so like I said, not many of my applications consist of just this sort of thing. I want to be able to start using this for real. And it's fantastic for applications, but it's just as good for documents, or things that would typically be considered documents. So things where you got headers and content and asides and images and stuff like that. So now I'm going to go back briefly. I'll show you the example first, and then we'll talk about the code, to that some assembly required example. So here, if you look, we've got a header, we've got some text, we've got the best person in the world, and we've got a footer at the bottom. We don't make mistakes, just happy little accidents. Now, this is actually fine. The way that it is, there's really nothing horribly wrong with this layout. It's not exactly what we want, but everything's just kind of straight line. This would probably be a fairly effective mobile layout, but we can do more on a desktop. So what I want to do is I want to use some of these new things that we've learned, some of the grid stuff that we've learned, as well as introduce a couple of ideas that we haven't seen yet to start playing with this layout. That's the reason I call it a happy little sandbox. So let's see what sort of trouble we can get into rearranging Bob Ross's little article here. So this example is example sandbox. Make this slightly smaller so I can see more on my screen. And just to show you what we're working with, here's the HTML for it. Not really anything shocking. Now, immediately people are going to start going, wait a minute, why aren't you using like the header element? Why aren't you using the main element? We'll get there. For right now, I just wanted to show you plain old divs with classes applied to them, because you're going to see a lot of grid code that's going to work against HTML that looks like this. Also, you might not always have control over the HTML that you're having to deal with grid. So knowing how to deal with HTML that may not be optimally designed, often really useful. So you can see at the very beginning, I already have one thing that I told you I wouldn't normally have. There's this big wrapper div around the whole thing. So there's a div that goes from the top all the way down to the bottom. And I've given it a class of sandbox so that we'll be able to grab a hold of it later. My heading, no big shock, class of heading. I have a div in the middle with a bunch of paragraphs inside. It's got all the content. And then finally, here's our picture of Bob. And an H2 that we gave a class of footer at the bottom, because I'm pretending I don't know about the footer element yet, with our footer text inside of it. And that's the whole thing. Not terribly complicated HTML. We can get a lot more complicated than this, and we will. But we got a lot of pieces that we can play with now. We got a lot of stuff that we can move around with grid. But what we don't have is much happening over in the CSS. So I've given you a little bit of CSS to start with, so that you can actually see we got a background color that's behind each one of these things. Inside of the sandbox, every element inside the sandbox has been given a background color of white. And the reason that I did that is so it's very obvious where each thing is on the page as we start moving it around. I put a little bit of padding in place so that we weren't right up against the wall on our viewport. But there's no grid. There's no nothing in here that says lay things out a certain way. It's basically all just source order. I've given you a few empty spots down at the bottom because we know we're going to want to put some rules in there in just a second, but they're not there yet. The only rule we've really got is the thing that says, make Bob really wide. And Bob is really, really wide right now. This is probably the biggest Bob Ross you've ever seen in your life. Everybody just feels warmer already. Okay, so let's do some stuff. Our sandbox element, that's that big wrapper div. We want to put something in there that says, okay, I'm going to start moving stuff around, and that is display :grid. Now, that's the only thing I'm going to change. Save that, go back here, and take a look and see what happens. Literally nothing. There's just nothing to see here. And that's fine. If you give display grid without any additional rules, you're basically going to get things laid out in the order that they came inside of the DOM. There are a few small tweaks, and if we came in here and did something like grid gap, and I'll say something really crazy like 50 pixels, then as soon as I refresh, you can actually see these are grid items. And that's the technical term. Each one of those things that shows up in a grid cell or a set of grid cells, that's an item in the grid or a grid item. And what we're saying with grid gap is how much space that we want between each one of those cells. So rows and columns can have gaps between them. This may not seem like a big deal, but this is surprisingly hard to do, or hard to do consistently, and grid makes it trivially easy. We just say, we'd like these cells ranged in this way and put this much space between them. So if you've ever struggled a little bit with Flexbox and the whole space around, space between, and trying to figure out what to do, this is grid kind of leaning that way. And it kind of gets to a theme of one of the differences between grid and flex, which is flex is mostly about flexibility, the squishiness of your layout, Rachel Andrew likes to call it. Grid, while it can be made very, very flexible, and we'll see examples of that, leans a little more toward the rigidity, where you can say, I want this specific layout. Sure, these things can move around in a certain way and they can adjust around one another, but primarily we want this layout. More rigidity, less squishiness. That doesn't mean they can't be used together. It doesn't mean they can't be used for a lot of the same thing. There's huge overlap between what you can do with grid and what you can do with flex. And we'll talk a little bit about where it makes sense to use one or the other. But in large part, a lot of what you might have reached for flex to do, you can totally do with grid. And personally, I often find it easier. At least I find the API surface a bit more straightforward. To me, this was a little easier to understand than some of the spacing mechanisms in flex, for example. All right, so we've got display grid, we've given a grid gap, but we want to start putting things side by side. So you saw an example of that earlier. If you remember, we were on example blocks, and sure enough, we had this grid template columns with a repeat. So we're going to reach for that first. We're going to come back over here and say grid if I could spell, grid, template, columns. And I'm not going to use the repeat trick yet. I'm just going to put a couple of values in there. So I'm going to say like 200 pixels and 300 pixels. Notice I haven't placed anything anywhere. I haven't said put the header in a certain place, put the body in a certain place, put the image anywhere. All I did was I said my grid has 2 columns. One of them is 200 pixels, one of them is 300 pixels. And that is really too narrow. So we're going to say 500 and like 800. And now you can actually see the grid beginning to take shape. Even though we didn't explicitly place anything, the automatic layout algorithm that Grid has living behind it starts to put things in the individual spots. This isn't really a surprise. We saw exactly the same thing happening with our blocks. But now they're not just blocks. They're actual H2s and divs with a class on them. And they're beginning to land in the different places that we've defined in our grid. Notice also what's happened to Bob. Bob's gotten a lot more manageable. He doesn't take over the entire width of the page anymore. We gave that 100% width, and 100% can mean a lot of different things at a lot of different times. In this grid item, it means take up the width of that grid item. I am glossing over an amazing number of details by saying that. But for now, it takes up 100% of the width of that grid item. Later on, we start to get a little fancy with images. You'll see more tricks that we can do. But already, this is pretty useful. But this isn't everything we want to do. I'm going to back off a little bit on this so I can have more space to play with. We really want to start placing things in specific spots. For example, this header, it's not really a header anymore. It'd sure be nice if it took up the entire width of the content that we're working with here. So that's the first thing that I want to try to solve. So that is a div with class heading. Just to remind you what that looks like, we've got our div class of heading. That's the thing I want to make stretch all the way across the page. I got lots of ways to do that. I'm going to show you one of those ways, and I'll warn you, it's going to get a little bit unwieldy as we begin to take this technique further. That's totally cool. We want to understand how it works so that we can do it better a little bit later on. So in here, I want my heading to take up a specific place. So I'm going to say grid, column, start, and column 1. Okay, so let's see if that changes anything. Nope. Why didn't it change anything? Because it was already starting in column 1. Then people are like, wait a minute, we're all programmers. Isn't it supposed to be column 0? No, sorry, column 1. CSS was not made for you. It was made for those people that we have to like take their Photoshop mockups and make them make sense. 1. We already started at column 1. So there's not really anything different there, but what we can do is say we want to take up more columns. So instead of saying grid, column, start here, let's try, you remember tables? What did we do in tables when we wanted a cell to take up like more stuff? We did spans. So I'm going to try spanning a couple of these columns. Oh my God, look at that. Remember what I said sometimes, like working with grid is almost like working with tables without tables? This is kind of what I mean. It was already started in column 1, so we didn't have to specify that, but we could say we want to take up this many of those columns, span 2 of those columns. And sure enough, that's exactly what we've done. We didn't explicitly have to place this anywhere. We simply said, take up this much room. Cool. That does now mean that our content block, the div of class equal content, is starting down here on the second row. So we start in column 1, row 1 for our header, span 2 columns, and end up with our content starting in column 1 of row 2. Now that seems a little bit weird because I didn't say anything about rows up here. Well, that's fine. Grid totally is okay with that. We'll get deeper into it later, but there's the idea of what's known as an explicit grid, the grid that you've defined, and the implicit grid, the grid that gets created for you as you begin using it. And if you have more things than you've actually defined places for, grid's cool with that. It's like, great, I'll just start giving you more. An explicit grid and an implicit grid. If we flip back over to Firefox briefly and go to where we actually want to be, we can take a look at our, notice, div sandbox. It realizes it has a grid on it, so it's like, oh, you can turn the grid overlay on if you want. And sure enough, there's our grid overlay. And if you look very closely, you can actually see that grid forming up. So the outermost boundaries, that solid red line, I made it red so it was easier to see, that's the boundaries of the explicit grid. But as we get further out, our boundary lines begin to get dashed and dotted, and they have different appearances depending on where you are in the grid, and that's the implicit grid beginning to show up. Now, the wonderful thing is we've actually got rules that we could set here about how CSS Grid creates that implicit grid for us, but we don't have to specify all of the rules for every possible item in the grid. We haven't done that here. We've simply said we're going to have 2 columns, and then everything begins landing in those 2 columns, unless we've told it to take up more than 2 columns, like we did here. So far, so good. So, what do I want to do next? Well, I kind of want my content to take up more room, but I don't want to lose Bob. I'm kind of liking Bob being up higher. So let's try to put Bob where we really want him to be, like maybe over here on the left-hand side. All right, so Bob, well, what do you think Bob's class is? Sure enough, class Bob. We said he takes up 100%. Let's put him grid, column, start. Well, what column should Bob start in? Not 0, 1. All right. Making one tiny change at a time. Let's see what happens. Okay, well, Bob's in column 1, but there's a problem. We kind of wanted him to the left of our content, but that didn't happen. Why is that? Well, it's because that automatic flow algorithm is doing what it's supposed to do. It's like, well, you told me where certain things were positioned, so I'm going to flow stuff around those things. I'm going to make things make sense unless you tell me more rules in order to position things. Fortunately, you can absolutely say you have more rules. So we don't want Bob to just start at column 1. We also want Bob to start at row 1. All right, one tiny change. Let's see what happens. Oops, row 1 is not actually what we wanted. We actually wanted row 2. This is what we wanted. We wanted Bob off to the left-hand side. We wanted the content on the right-hand side. We want the header to go all the way across. Let's see what terrible and awful things have happened to our footer. Well, they're not actually that bad. How would we fix the footer here? Span 2. All right. So what is our footer? Our footer is, because we don't understand HTML sectioning elements yet, H2 of a class of footer. So I'm going to grab this footer. I'm going to say that the grid column for that is span 2. There we go. I'm going to back way off so you can see the whole thing. We have our header spanning all the way across the top. We got Bob on the left. We got our content on the right. They're taking up the amount of space that we wanted to, so Bob's a little narrower than the content. And we got the footer that goes all the way across the bottom. Now, we took a bunch of tiny steps to get there, but if you step back and look at what we had to do, it wasn't actually that terrible. We said that we wanted a display of grid, gave a little bit of gap. I'm actually going to bump that gap down so we don't have to worry about it as much. We defined what our columns would look like, and then after that, it was basically a few tweaks where we took advantage of the way that grid automatically lays things out for us. It was really just like span 2 with the header, span 2 with the footer, put Bob in the right place. Get the idea? All right. I'm almost scared to ask how we're doing with our local installs. I see lots of thumbs up. Okay. So hidden away in our examples here, or excuse me, in our application, we've got workshops. So I'm going to start you off really simple. And since I am a programmer and not a designer, I started my workshops at 0. So if you look at workshop 0, we got 4 divs laid out. They're not doing anything special. About the only styling on this page is the borders and the background color for the divs, and a little bit of padding so they weren't sitting right up against the edge. If you look in the source code, you'll see that there is a workshop 0. And workshop 0 has all the pieces that you need inside of it. Here's our HTML. Should look shockingly familiar. It's basically iterating over a bunch of labels. Get a div for each one of them. Our TypeScript is creating those labels for us, but instead of creating 20 of them or 5 of them, it's creating 4, I less than 5. The CSS is really just styling the host element enough so that you've got some padding and making the divs visible on the screen. So what I want you to do is, using these tiny little building blocks, I want you to play with some of the ideas that we've just talked about. I want you to set this thing up with display grid. And then I want you to position some of those things in places on that grid. Go crazy, wherever you want them to be. I want you to make them different sizes. I want you to make them span multiple columns. Also want you to make them span multiple rows. Once you've got some interesting things going on in your little toy grid, go into Firefox and take a look at what you can actually see with the grid inspector. Experiment with the tools that you're going to end up using a whole lot. Now, we have a workshop that's coming not too far after this. It's going to build on these ideas plus the ones we were just looking at with Bob to build what's known as the Holy Grail layout. But don't try to go there yet. All I really want you to do at this point is play with some of the ideas that we've exposed you to: display grid, the host selector, things like that. So we'll take 5-10 minutes, experiment with that stuff, and then we'll move on to some more interesting things that will build on the ideas that we've already done and also show you how you can make this a lot less tedious. Everybody good? Go forth and conquer. All right. So let's play with this idea a little bit. First thing I'm going to need to do is make this thing display grid. Well, I already had a display there. Change it to display grid. Save. See if that made any difference at all. Nope. Just as expected. Didn't really make any difference. But we want to start putting things in different places on this page. So I can arbitrarily decide what I want to do here. It was really up to you how you wanted to place things. One key to that is having some way to grab a hold of an individual div. And if you recall, we have these labels that we're building, and I'm specifically saying that each one of these divs has a title property based on the label. That gives me a really easy way to grab a hold of an individual div, because this label property ends up as an attribute, or the value of an attribute on that div. So in the CSS, I can reach in and say, all the divs are going to look like that, but a specific div with a title of, say, 3, actually I'll put it in quotes, that way it'll actually work, I can make a little bit different. So I'll move that to the top so you can see it. Specifically, I want the border to be 4 pixels solid red on this guy. Let's see what happens. Nothing. All right. So we go in here, take a look, title, label. We'll make it really easy on ourselves. We'll say that we'll just, I don't want to cheat. I don't want to cheat. Div 3 and background color blue. It's already blue. Nope, still nothing. Jeez. Excuse me? Oh, of course. There we go. I'm so glad you're here. There we go. Isn't that attractive? Christmas colors all of a sudden. Good, let's fix that. All right, light green. All right, so now that I can actually see that div, I want to put him specifically somewhere on the page. Well, that's pretty easy. We can say that we want our grid row to be like 2 and our grid column to be 3. Now, there's going to be a problem. We haven't actually defined any of this stuff yet. So grid is making this up for us. This is a little bit weird. It's kind of like with arrays in JavaScript. If you say, my array is 10 items long and I want to put something in slot 100, it just does it. So we've got a similar thing going on here. We actually want to give this grid a little bit of definition. Well, we know how to do that. Grid, template, columns, and we can say that we want to repeat like 3 times at 200 pixels. So now we actually have a little bit of definition. And we can say that we want a grid gap of 20 pixels again. So now we've got our grid beginning to form up. If we wanted the 3 div to take up a little more room, pretty easy. Let's go to that 3 and say that it needs to span 2. So you see what's happening? This is a little bit strange because it's like, wait a minute, didn't we tell it to start in a certain... Yes, we did. We told it exactly where to start, and then we told it to span a certain amount of space, a certain number of cells, and so CSS Grid has extended the grid for us in that particular direction. Now, sometimes what we want to do is we want to say, I want you to start at the beginning and go to the end, but I don't specifically want to tell you where the end is. So let's imagine that with div number 3, we wanted to do that. That's a pretty cool trick. Notice, I didn't need to know or care how big the grid was in order for this to work. So, in case you can't see what I'm doing, I've said what row to start with, but for the particular column, I said start in column 1 and go to the last column. -1 is counting back from the other side. And if we're in Firefox and we turn on our grid inspector for our workshop, if you look very closely, look at that. That's line number -1 and row number -1. So if we want to position things like in a corner in the far right-hand bottom, we can totally do that by saying -1, -1. Or if we wanted to come back to -2, we could do that. So we could say that this guy should go from the beginning to this line. See how this works? Now, this is all wonderful. This gives us a lot of the primitives that we need in order to start really moving things around and positioning stuff on the page. But unfortunately, it is fairly primitive. You need these things, but it would sure be nice to work at a higher level. So let's start moving up the stack a little bit. So you remember back here with Bob, we used that span trick and the column start, row start, stuff like that to position things specifically on the page. Well, we want to get smarter about that. What would be really nice is if we didn't have to do so much math, because it's really easy to get wrong. Do you remember when I was first trying to position Bob? I put him in the first row instead of the second row, and I'm like, oh crap, let me move that down. Easy mistake to make, and you make it all the time. What would be really nice is if you had some way to lay things out where you didn't have to depend on that stuff so hard. And there absolutely is a way to do it. So in here, we're going to go ahead and move to another workshop. See, I lulled you all into a false sense of security, and now we're going to be writing a fair amount of code. So this looks a lot like our Bob example. Except instead of Bob, it's another really cool dude, Carl Sagan. I did remember the space theme. It's Carl Sagan, some quotes from the book Pale Blue Dot by Carl Sagan, and a picture of us. Most of you weren't born when this picture was taken, but we are all here, and that's Earth. This is the pale blue dot in the essay. And what we want to do is we want to lay this thing out kind of the way that we did with Bob, but we don't want to use the same tricks that we did before. So I'm going to save you a little bit of energy and a little bit of thought and show you what I would do to lay this out, and then you can do the equivalent. You can either follow along or you can do it after I've shown you how it works. So this is workshop 1. In workshop 1, I've got all those pieces as HTML, but I've started taking advantage of some of those HTML sectioning elements that we mentioned. I've still got my wrapper div. I'll keep him around for the moment, but he'll go away eventually. But now I've got a header element. I've got this main element that has all of our paragraphs inside of it. I've got a couple of images with classes on them, so they're easy to grab a hold of. I've got an aside, another one of those HTML sectioning elements, and finally a footer. Now you might think, wow, everything's different now. How do I use grid for all this? Exactly the same way. You're just applying grid rules to selectors. And in this case, the selectors are going to be element names or class names. So we can grab a hold of the header just the way we did with .content or .footer or .heading. It's just an element name instead. And since we're in an Angular application, and Angular does view encapsulation for us, it means that we don't run afoul of other problems by having rules like this that would normally cause the wheels to just fly off your application everywhere. We've encapsulated this rule to just the one place that we want it to exist. But what I want to do here is I want to lay out an article, much like the page, much like I did with Bob, but I don't want to use all those span tricks like I did earlier. They work, but they're tedious. So the first place I'm going to start is with display grid. So that's great, puts us in this grid context we can work with. And now I want to set up my grid, but I don't want to set my grid up the way that I did earlier. I want to take advantage of this wonderful thing called grid template areas. And in here, I can basically draw a little chart. I can say that I want my header to go all the way across the page. If I wanted to, I could give it the specific size of that header row. I want to make my main element, do the same thing. I want my footer to go across the bottom. I need to put those pictures somewhere, so I'll put Carl in one of those spots, and I'll put the pale blue dot in another one. Now, I've actually built this layout so that it looks exactly the same as what we've currently got. And I'm not quite finished. I still have more to do. I need to say what each one of those grid areas actually corresponds to. But that's pretty easy. You can probably guess what each one is going to mean. So along with those grid template areas, I'm going to say that I have a header, and I'm just targeting the header element, and I'm saying that the grid area for the header is called header. Those names do not have to match. They happen to in this particular case. So let's see if we've made any progress here. Everything looks the same. Well, it kind of should, because our source order layout and our grid layout so far is exactly the same. I'll put a grid gap in here so you can actually see some of this stuff start showing up. Grid gap, and we'll make it nice and large so it's easy to see. See if that makes any difference. Sure enough, now you can see where our header actually lives on the page. But just to prove to you that something's going on, let's try flipping header and main. Aha! Something has actually changed. Now, we haven't specified a grid area for anything except our header, but this is already doing some work for us. Our main is in the slot right above where our header is. Our header is now somehow down on the page. So this gives us a clue as how we do the rest of this stuff. I'm going to put header back where it belongs, and I'm going to start adding areas for all the other elements. So main should be in grid area called main, and footer should be in the grid area called, go ahead and you guess, footer. A little more complicated to deal with the images, but not a lot. They have classes, so we can't target them by element name, but one of them is called Carl, and his grid area is Carl. Notice it's not the same as the dot class name, it's just Carl, because that's all we called it right up here. We could have called it Bob. It would have been confusing, but it would work. And then finally, PBD. That's where our pale blue dot image is supposed to go, and we'll put that in exactly what you would expect, grid area PBD. Now again, nothing really changed at this point because we've kept the source order and the grid order basically the same. If you notice, our footer is still showing up exactly where the source order said that it should. So that's the first thing that we could fix. We kind of want, it's our side. We kind of want to move some things around a little bit. So let's move Carl up to the top. How would we do that? Well, it's as easy as going in here and saying, I'd really prefer Carl to be up here. So he'll be right under the header. Now, before I make this any more complicated, are you kind of getting the picture? Literally, are you kind of getting the picture? You're drawing a diagram of your layout, and everything can be put in each one of those individual slots. Now, this is great, but if you remember, we had Bob earlier, and Bob, well, he was off to the side. So we kind of like to be able to do stuff like that, too. So we need to be able to define multiple columns. And it's a little bit unusual, but it's not hard to do. We can say that we're actually going to have a couple of columns, and things are going to fall into those different slots. So we'll just make the header and the footer go across two different columns, and we'll make Carl stay off to the left-hand side of main. Yep. Would help if I went back to Carl. Look at that. Our header goes all the way across the top. Was that almost some applause? I didn't make it. I'm just using it, but yay. So the picture is off the left, main on the right, our aside or our footer, everything's laying out where we expected it to. This is pretty cool, except I made a typo. There we go. Now, once we do it, everything should be where it's supposed to be. I'll zoom way out so you can see. Even the zoom level doesn't actually affect the placement. We're still good. So by default, these things are simply taking up the entire width of the viewport that we're working with, and we can make this as complicated as we want. If we needed 10 columns, we could say the header stretches from column 7 to column 9, and main goes from all the way at the left to all the way at the right, and the pictures are wherever you want them to be, and it all just works. If I wanted to, I could come in here and say that the header should be a certain height. Remember, grid's all about 2 dimensions, and you really have complete control over that. So if I wanted to, I could say that this needs to be 300 pixels tall. So now our header is going to be a little more aggressive. Oh, I killed my layout, I apologize. So in here, we'll do auto here, and we'll actually give these things some widths as well, just to do the whole thing out. So off the left-hand side, I want this to be 200 pixels wide, and this to be like 500 pixels wide. Oh, excuse me. Also need to generalize a bit. There we go. So now you see what I've done. I've made the header a header. I've made the picture quite a bit narrower by specifying some measurements around the edges of the grid, but everything's still working the way it's supposed to. So I went from grid template areas to a thing called grid template. There's even a shorter-hand syntax called just grid where you can specify even more things. But what I've basically said here is, here are the slots where things are going to fall into. Here's how tall that's supposed to be. These others, they're going to take up whatever room they take up. In fact, I can usually just leave this auto out. There are other places where I want to specify it. But it takes up as much room as it needs to. And then, after a slash, I'm saying how wide each one of these things needs to be as a column. And everything falls into place. And again, if I want to move stuff around, if for whatever reason I decided that I really need my footer to be at the very top of my page, then I could do that. Now, I will warn you, it's easy to get drunk with power with this. Source order is still important. Super important for things like accessibility, screen readers. They're not paying attention to what your grid layout looks like. So try to resist the urge to go in and just vomit out your elements wherever they happen to land on the page, and then use CSS to put them wherever they belong, because some things will still care about that actual source order. So usually what I do is not what you see me doing right here. I keep the order matching the source order, but if I wanted to, it means that it's very easy for me to do things like, I'll move PBD here, and I'll make Carl take up slightly more space. So now I'm not really changing the order of things that people might get to with their screen readers, but it all still works. So you see now my footer is landing in a different place. Anyway, I want you to take advantage of this grid template and grid template areas idea and lay out workshop 1 however you would like to lay it out. You don't have to do the same thing that I've done. Feel free to manipulate the HTML if you want to. In fact, one of the things I really want to do is come in here and get rid of that wrapper div. I don't want that to exist. I don't need that. So I can get rid of it. Now everything's going to be broken, but it's very easy for me to go and fix it, because all I have to do is take advantage of the really handy host selector that says grab a hold of the element that I'm sitting inside of and style it accordingly. I need to change the .sandbox rule down here as well so that it says everything inside the host element. But now we're back in business. So take a few minutes, do that, and then we'll move on to more cool stuff. The plan, by the way, here, just so you know, is we're probably going to do 1, maybe 2 more workshops, but if we do 2, it'll be a really short one combined with one of the other ones. And the last half or third of these things is mainly me showing you some of the things that you can do. If we stopped and did workshops for them, they take up all the remaining time, but I don't want you to leave here without an understanding of the kind of crazy stuff you can get up to with Grid. Because if in your mind you're thinking, okay, cool, it's great for page layout, I totally get that. It is, but that's not the entire story. Or it's great for things that are rectangles with borders on them. It is, but that's not the entire story. There's so much more that you can do with Grid, and several of the examples are about showing off some of those things and showing that you're not limited to just the fairly conservative things that we've done so far. Before we completely move on from this particular workshop, I wanted to show you a couple of things that we're going to get into more detail on here in the next couple of steps. First of all, this is what we were working with before. We had our 300 pixel high header. We had specific column widths that we had set up. And if you notice, one of the things that we've lost is that beautiful full page thing that we had going on earlier. So adding Grid seems to have taken us a step backwards. We can totally put that back. And in fact, that's a great way to introduce one of the more wonderful features of Grid, and that's what's known as the fractional unit, the FR unit, where you can say, I don't know how much space I have, but I would like to take this chunk of it. So let's try that. Over here, instead of 500 pixels, what I really want to do is take up all of the remaining space. I want my leftmost column to be 200 pixels wide, but then I want my right-hand column to just take up the room it needs, the room it has available. And I can say 1FR to do that. And now when I refresh, notice that we're stretching all the way across the page again. This is great. And in fact, if the page changes size, it changes right along with it. Notice the padding is maintained. We haven't lost anything. We're no scroll bars at the bottom. Everything's hunky-dory. And in fact, I'm not limited to just one of those. I could say that I want a fraction of the room on the left and a fraction of the room on the right. And now I'm going to end up with half and half. Because it's taking all those FRs that you're adding together, it's like adding them all up and says, okay, they've asked for one FR and another FR, that's two FRs. And then they want this one to be one of those wide and the other one to be one of those wide, so 50%, 50%. This may not seem like a big deal, but it is huge. It is really, really helpful. In fact, I'm lying to you about the percent thing because that wouldn't actually work here. Let's try it with 50% and 50% because that seems like a really natural thing to do. But notice what's happened. We have the dreaded horizontal scroll bar at the bottom. We got the little bit of jag back and forth. And the reason for that is why? Well, we defined our grid with a 50 pixel gap in the middle. We want that gap. We want the things to be separated from one another. But then we said our columns were individually 50% each. And so 50% of the width plus another 50% of the width plus another 50 pixels means we get a horizontal scroll bar. FR units don't have this problem. They are sensitive to the way the grid actually works. So we can say 1 FR, 3 FR, for example. And now it says 1/4 of the room is going to go over here and 3/4 are going to go over there. This also works vertically. So you can say you want to take up space. So if you like define a height for your entire viewport or for what you want to use in your viewport, you can take up fractional elements of it. So let's see that in a little more action. If I go in here, I'm going to go to the ooh pretty step. Remember, space theme, woo. So it's just a simple image gallery. But it's an image gallery that takes advantage of that FR unit stuff. So if I come in here and start resizing the browser, notice what's happening to the images. They're getting slightly narrower until there's not enough room anymore, and then we break across rows. So this is using the FR in conjunction with some other really nifty grid stuff in order to make this gallery very squishy. Remember I said that Flexbox is all about flexibility and squishiness, but you could get a lot of that with grid as well. The FR unit is often where that squishiness is going to come in, that extra flexibility that you want. So we look at this one. This is our image gallery. First thing, we've got a little more going on in our component TypeScript that we did before, but I'm only bringing it up so I can tell you don't really need to worry about it. It is going to my space images service and grabbing the planetary nebula set of images. That 80 plus megabytes that you downloaded earlier, some of those pictures. So congratulations, you now have a set of planetary nebula on your computer. And there is where they all landed. So how do we make that happen? Well, in the HTML, not a real shock. It's just an image element repeated as many times as you have one of these planetary image objects, and we're grabbing the thumbnail out of it, and again, saying or put a title on it so it's easy to grab with our CSS if we want to. So nothing really exciting in the TypeScript or the HTML, and that's a feature. We don't want a bunch of layout crap in our HTML. We just want to say, here's the stuff. Now put the stuff where it actually belongs. The place where you define where it belongs is in the CSS. And in the CSS, here is our definition. No big surprise, we start off with a display grid. We've said we want 20 pixels in between each element, each item, each cell of the grid. We've done a little bit of additional work just to make the thing slightly more appealing. So we give it that gray background color so those black images with the cool space images begin to pop. We put a little bit of padding around the whole thing so that they're not slammed up against the wall. But the magic is right there. I specifically include this example because you will see some version of this pattern over and over and over again. It seems a little bit complicated, but after you've seen it 500 times the way that I have now, you'll be able to type it with your eyes closed. It's essentially saying that we are going to want to automatically fill up the available space that we have, in this case horizontally because we're dealing with columns, and we want to make sure that everything is at least 150 pixels wide, but can take up to 1 fraction of the available space. Well, what is 1 fraction of the available space? And the answer is, it totally depends on how much room there is to work with. So as we move the browser back and forth, everything is changing and squeezing and moving around because we've said take up the room that you've got, but don't ever let anything get narrower than 150 pixels. So this repeat plus autofill plus min-max and a lower bound and the 1FR, very, very common pattern. That's basically a magic spell in Grid. You will use it over and over and over again. Everything else in here, just details. We've said that our image elements should take up all the available room that they have within the cell that we're working with, and we're doing object fit cover, not specifically a Grid thing, but it's a wonderful, fairly recent addition to CSS, well, recent as these things go, that simply says, I'm going to want to put this image and have it not get squeezed and change the aspect ratio. I want it to like fit in the middle of this thing. So if you notice, as we begin moving around, the individual images, see if I can zoom in and show you, they are actually changing a little bit, getting a bit narrower, but we're keeping the image basically in the middle. So if you want to see some cool tricks you can do with images, object fit, cover, contain, and a bunch of other settings that you can use that make stuff like this super easy to do. Again, not specific to Grid, but really, really handy to have around. So there's not a lot going on here, but there is a lot going on here. The FR unit is your best friend. Think of that, FR friend. You will use it all the time. Don't use percentages. They're almost never useful in Grid because you almost always end up having to do some horrific calc call in order to make percentages make sense when you should have just reached for FR in the first place. FR is what you're going to want to use instead of percentages. It just makes things so much easier. All right. A couple of things that I jumped over to get to the image gallery. The good Grid's gone bad is mostly an excuse to play with the debugging tools. But there's a new thing in here we haven't seen before, so I don't want to completely skip over it. Notice 7 and 3. Turns out that one of the coolest features of Grid is the ability to overlap elements. So far, we haven't seen that. Header's been where the header goes, and the content goes where the content goes, and the footer goes where the footer goes. But it turns out that you can overlap things very, very easily in Grid. So I'm going to show you a simple example of this, and then show you one that's a little more realistic. So in the debugging step, again, we've got a whole bunch of labeled divs, just like we had before. We've got those divs laid out in the HTML, but with no styling, no layout applied to them directly. And then in the CSS, we've said how we want the grid to work. Well, this one's a much simpler definition. We simply said we want 5 columns and 5 rows, each of them 100 pixels wide. Same definition we've seen before. But down here, we started positioning things so that they deliberately overlap. Notice, 3 starts in column 1, goes 3 cells wide. If we look down further, 7 specifically takes up 1 column all the way to the left-hand side. That's how we end up with this whole thing stretching top to bottom. It didn't specifically say a span. It simply said start at the beginning, go to the end. Well, turns out that that overlaps with 3, and that's totally cool. There's nothing wrong with that. That's not an error. It's not a bug. You want to take advantage of it. I don't know how much work you've ever had to do with like absolute and relative positioning and z-index and all that. Grid makes stuff like that so much easier. You can lay out your page and then simply say, I want these things here and these to be on top of them. And you can use z-index to determine the order. Really, really easy to do. A little more exciting version of that is the When Worlds Collide. Space theme. Woo. Now, I have specifically set this up so that most of the smaller planets, Venus and Mars and Earth, are taking up one by one. But Saturn's taking up more room horizontally, Jupiter's taking up more room both horizontally and vertically, and then I've explicitly positioned some other things in odd places inside the grid. It gives me a chance to show off some of the things you can do that we've talked about and some of the things that we haven't seen before. So in here, overlap, there we go. Here's our HTML. We're just putting out pictures of planets. So in this case, instead of grabbing the planetary nebulae, we grab the planets themselves. That's what the TypeScript does for us. It simply says, grab a hold of the planets. We're seeing them one image at a time. Everything's really happening in the CSS. Same definition that we've seen before, all the way down to the grid gap. I've done a little bit of alignment stuff just to make sure things show up in the upper left-hand corner of each one of these items. Didn't really need to do that here, but it gave me a chance to talk about the ability that you have to align things individually if you want to, but over the entire grid, which is often what you want to do. We've seen a little bit of this already with the place shorthand. So in this case, we're simply saying align, in other words, move things vertically to the top. But we could have also done justification here if we wanted to. Each one of the images is going to take up 100% of its available width of the container. I've given it a border, just to make that border a little more obvious. I'll change that to red so that you can see it. And you'll see that each one of these things is really just taking up the size of the image as we've specified it. That, by the way, is also a wonderful debugging trick. A lot of people, I'm surprised, don't know about the outline property. People use borders for this all the time, and there's nothing really wrong with that, except that borders take up space. Outline specifically lives outside of your element and doesn't take up any space. So if you really want to see where a thing is without having the border affect the positioning, outline is actually what you want. Now, admittedly, you probably should be using like a debugging tool, like the Chrome DevTools or Firefox, but sometimes you just want console log for CSS, and that is it. All right, so here's where we start positioning things. We put Mercury. Hello? Good. We put Mercury up in the upper left-hand corner, or excuse me, we use the negative one, so we put it specifically in the right-hand bottom corner. So this is Mercury right here. Earth, we put at a specific row and column index. So that's how Earth ended up here. We could have also counted backwards if we wanted to. So far, all stuff that you've seen before. Saturn and Jupiter are a little more interesting because they're taking up more room and they're being told to start at specific places. So in this case, we've said that Jupiter is going to start in row 3 and span for 2 of them. And whatever column it's in, it's going to span for 2 of those as well. So that's how Jupiter ends up taking up so much additional space. Saturn, same idea, except we specified not only the amount of room it takes up, but also where it starts. And those things can totally overlap. So we said that Saturn is going to start in column 3 and span for 3. Let's see what happens if we put Jupiter in column 3. Just what you would expect. Now Saturn is on top of Jupiter, and so is Earth. Because I snuck something in there while you weren't watching. I said that Earth has a z-index of 1, so everything else with a z-index of 0 is going to be behind it. Earth wins. Moral of the story is, grid is fantastic, not only for positioning things in an absolute way, but you are not limited at all in overlapping those things. So if, like me, you've ever struggled with relative positioning, absolute positioning, trying to get things on top of other things, this is a great way to do it without having to struggle with all that stuff. All right. So I've told you about the grid template areas thing, and it's been really cool, but we've used it for basically really simple stuff at this point. I want to show you how you can stretch it. You can really kind of go crazy with it. So breaking away from the space theme for a moment, let's take a look at a deck of cards. These are not pictures. There are pictures here, but the pictures are the faces on the face cards. Everything else that you see here is actually done with HTML and CSS. So if I zoom out, we've got all the cards. All 4 suits, all the ranks. What we're doing is we're generating each one of those things. So if I look in here in the playing cards example, you'll see that I've set up a little more component action than we've had before. We've got suits and we've got ranks. That gives us things to iterate over from our HTML. In our HTML, we've said that for each one of the suits and each one of the ranks, we want to show a playing card. Everybody here familiar with ng-container? If you're not, you are going to love me. ng-container is fantastic because it's a way of attaching logic inside of a template without actually without needing an element for that logic to go along with. ng-container disappears at runtime. You just end up with whatever you generated. So in this case, we're essentially using these for their looping capability, but there are no elements in the DOM once we're done. The only thing we end up with is a bunch of playing cards. If I inspect this, you'll see that apart from some comments that show where ng-container was, all we have are playing cards. So in here, I want to back up. There we go. There's our individual playing card. Collapse this guy. Lots and lots and lots of playing cards, courtesy of ng-container. Again, nothing to do with grid, But given the way that Grid works, and the fact that Grid works on like direct children of whatever container you're using, oftentimes ng-container is the thing that you want to reach for in order to make sure that you only have elements at the level you want them. All right, so now we have a whole bunch of playing card components, which means that we finally get to do a little bit of Angular stuff and look at a completely separate component. Here's our playing card component. And you might think things are going to get really crazy in the HTML. Well, they do, but maybe not in the way you expect. This is what a playing card looks like when you put it under an X-ray in HTML. So we have an entire wrapper div of playing card with an additional class of front around it. So there's a good excuse to actually have a wrapper div. And we're applying a specific class to it. And we're going to see how that gets used in just a second. And then we've got the rank in one corner and an inverted rank in the lower right-hand corner. This is the structure of a playing card. Here's our rank in the top left and our rank in the bottom right flipped over. We've got the suit that we're working with, but it's in the form of this pip. That's what these things are actually called, pips. Right there. And we've got an inverted one down at the bottom for the corner. And then in the middle, we have all of the stuff we need to do depending on whether there's a face for the face card or not. So if there is a picture associated with this thing, that's going to be a king or a queen or a jack. If there's not, then there's simply no image. And then we have a div that shows the appropriate number of pips for every card. So card number 7 has 7 of these symbols. But notice there's nothing in here that says, put the 7 symbols in a certain arrangement. All that's happening over in the CSS. So let's go there. Now I've done this with Sass just to make it a little bit easier to structure the CSS. There's nothing Sass specific about this other than that nesting. So our entire host for the playing card itself is of display block. But we're going to get to display grid in just a second. So screaming through a bunch of this stuff, it's mostly about sizing. This is the part you care about. There is the layout for a playing card. Stuff in each corner, flipped upside on the bottom right hand. We've got the design in the middle. And notice the design is going to take up 3 chunks in the middle. So it's horizontally centered and vertically centered, but taking up a specific amount of space. So we've got plenty of stuff to work with to lay out our pips in the right way. And if we keep going a little further down, more and more details, but the really important stuff, we start getting into individual cards. And I'm just going to scroll through them so you can see how this begins to look. Can you guess which one that is? That's 2. That's 3. That's 4, 5, and so on. I'm not recommending you actually do this, mind you. There are better ways to show pictures of playing cards. But mostly what I want to show you is how far you can take this whole grid template area thing. And notice each one of them not only has the template, the layout for the card, but also measurements associated with it. I could have simplified this a little bit, but I wanted you to see those FR units in action. So each one of these things is taking up the appropriate fraction of space, both horizontally and vertically, all the way down. And then finally, at the very end, after I've got all of those individual configurations set up, I'm associating them with the appropriate grid areas for each one. So I'm racing through this example because we don't have a lot of time, but I want you to take a look at it later when you get a chance and see the tricks that I'm using to really take full advantage, not only of grid, but of also several other CSS things just to do this ridiculous stunt. All right. So remember I said that we weren't at all limited to what we could do like nesting-wise with grids? This is a good example of that. So here in the I-object, these are all what are called media objects. I think Stubbornella came up with this, Nicole Sullivan, a few years ago, the idea of a media object. The internet is kind of made up of these media objects. If you look on Facebook, you see a picture, name, and then some text. And oftentimes those media objects are nested inside one another. Well, I built a simple version of this so that you've got, a picture, a name, and then a description for each one of these. These are all women astronomers and astrophysicists, by the way. And just like with our images, these things scale intelligently, and once you get below a certain level, begin to change the way that they wrap. So you're not just limited to cool tricks with images. These are individual Angular components that have a grid inside of them, and that grid is set up to be responsive within whatever responsive shell you've given it. So here in our example for media objects, we're showing one of these media object components for every one of the items in our list. All we're doing in the TypeScript is grabbing our data set that we're playing with. So this is where all the women in astronomy are coming from. And then in order to not play favorites, I'm shuffling the array every time I look at it so that different people show up at the top. And then finally, in the CSS, here's all I had to do in order to make that work. Now this is the overall grid. This is not the individual cards, the individual media objects, but I wanted to lay them out a certain way. Look familiar? We're repeating, automatically filling with a min-max. Can't get any lower than 300 pixels wide, but we can go up to one fraction of whatever space is available to us. You'll see this over and over and over again. The individual media object itself, a bit more complicated. The HTML is nice and simple. It simply says, take the image, take the header, take the description, lay them out in the HTML. No layout here at all. Nothing that says put them in a certain place other than the source order. But the CSS says, here's all the stuff that I want to do to make sure that it makes sense. So here's my grid template. We've got our image along the left-hand side. We've got our header above the description. The header takes up an automatic amount of room. The description is going to be at least 100 pixels high, but take up to the fraction of available space that you have. The image is going to be 100 pixels wide, and we're going to go from nothing up to 1 FR. Now that's another one I want you to commit to memory. You're eventually going to come up with some sort of grid where you're like, my items are growing in a way that I don't want them to. And the reason is because 1 FR really means min-max of auto to 1 FR. In other words, take up the space you need up to the amount of space available. Sometimes that's not what you want. Sometimes you want to say, take up maybe nothing and go up to the fraction of available space. So that min-max is 0 to 1 FR. It seems like you should be able to just change that to 1 FR. Doesn't work that way. Min-max 0 to 1 FR gives you the behavior that you often want. That's what makes this squishiness actually behave the right way. Now there's a bunch of other details in here, but they're mostly about making sure that when we get below a certain point, that things like these headers begin to put ellipses on there and they don't wrap in a way that we don't want them to. But none of that is grid specific. That's all just plain old CSS, but it works fantastically well inside of grid. So here's my header being told that it needs to go into the grid area called header with all the font stuff, and then these 3 little bits that say, make the header do the right thing when it gets too narrow. So just stuff like that. All right. I think I'm going to have to skip a workshop, but there's something that I want to show you that I think you'll really, really dig. In fact, 2 things back to back. First of all, we're all application developers, right? A lot of this stuff has involved things that look suspiciously like page layout. That's okay. You know, pages are still good. We have pages inside of our applications, but a lot of times what we want to do is actually lay out an application that takes up the entire viewport and we own the whole space. No scrolling. Or if there is scrolling, scrolling only in the spots we want. So here under so much room for activities, we've got a full viewport application. And notice we had a menu slide in from the side. Now I'm going to resize this whole thing. Watch what happens to the header and the footer. See how they're staying with me? This is not always easy to do. With grid, it's trivial. This menu can come and go. And notice it's overlaying, so it's slightly transparent. Grid layout, very straightforward. So here in our full viewport, we don't really have much going on that we haven't seen before inside the component. It's simply saying, give me a set of these space posters. That's what you're seeing there in the middle. They're really cool. You should look at them when you get a chance. The HTML says that we have a header section. That header section has the little close and open button that we were working with, and it has links inside of it, a link inside of it to go back to the home for this application. We've got a nav bar on the left-hand side, but notice it's just in source order, so we're just dropping elements in the HTML. We haven't said where any of them actually go yet. Down at the bottom, we have our main section. That's where all of our pretty posters show up, and then we have a footer that has some additional links in it, and nothing in here that looks like Bootstrap layout classes. Nothing in here that says put the nav bar on the left and make it slide in and out. Nothing that says keep the footer sticky at the bottom. All that's happening in the CSS. So in here, more of that grid template action that you've seen before, but with a couple of extra tricks. So our header goes across both of the columns that we've got defined. Our main section goes across both the columns we've got defined, and our footer goes across both the columns. So immediately you're thinking, why did you do that twice? Why didn't you just say header, main, and footer? Well, that's because we've got one other thing. We've got this little menu that pops in and out. But it lays over the top of things that we've defined in our grid template. So we didn't really have a great way to name it in our ASCII art. Instead, what we did was we said, name the lines on this grid. So before the beginning of the main section, and at the end of the main section, let's call that nav start and nav end. And notice we're doing that for two different places. We've got nav start, nav end, we've got nav start, nav end at the bottom. So we've got a columnar version of this and a row version of this. So this one, even though it's laid out like left to right, you might think that refers to columns. It really doesn't. It's saying that our navigation starts above the main and below the main. In other words, it takes up that amount of space. But it doesn't take up the entire width of the viewport. It only takes up the left-hand side. So there's our nav start and nav end. We didn't have a way to specify that in the grid template, but we do have a way to name it with the grid lines. And the really nifty thing is, if we name them the way I've named them here with the dash start and dash end, they become kind of this phantom grid area. So if we look down at the nav definition, I said grid area nav, even though there is nothing in that grid template that says nav. It's just the lines. Put all that together, and that means that the nav section has a home, but I don't always want it to show up. So I can send it that way, about a mile. And that's exactly what I've done. I've said translate from where we should be way to the left. If you look very closely, if I refresh this page, you see it actually comes swooping in. That's because when I first start up the application, I bring it from where it was over onto the page. You can actually see the menu show up. The important takeaway from this is that just because grid says where things go on a page doesn't mean they have to stay there. You've still got the ability to transform stuff and move it around. So 2 important ideas to take away here. One is the ability to define the entire viewport. So we've done that in several ways already, but they'd always like scrolled. So there's one other piece, and that is to say that the entire height that we're working with is 100% of the viewport. So we didn't want to stretch beyond it. We didn't want it to be too small. We wanted to take up all of that room. That's 100 VH. And then we lay out the grid on top of it to put everything where we care about. And then we have the ability to use things like transforms to move things off of the grid. And you can go really crazy with that stuff. For example, here's a bunch of female astronauts. And I've drawn in the background, if you look very carefully, see that gray line? That's actually the border around the grid element, the thing that we're sitting inside of. But if you notice, these pictures, they're not staying within that area. In fact, not only are they not staying within an area, they're breaking out a little bit. They can break way out. So we have the ability to transform, animate, do whatever we want to do in order to pick these things up and move them around. So the grid says where they would naturally be, but once you've got them where they would naturally be, you can put them wherever you want. And you can use this for more than just, nifty playing card views of astronauts, like this. So here's a video player. So on this, if I select one of these videos, you see the video player show up, and if the internet cooperates, you see the video player eventually show up as well. And I can scroll through and pick a different one, everything's hunky-dory. This is all laid out with grid, which is a little bit surprising because this thing is like coming towards you and tilted sideways, and how is all that working? It's all done the same way that I just showed you, where we have the video player, and that video viewer has just a handful of elements on it. We've got a video list and a player at the bottom. That's like the entire template is right there. Everything else is happening in the CSS. Where I say, here's how I want my grid to be laid out. And I want it to take up 100% of the viewport height. I want it to have a list on the left-hand side, a dead cell in the middle of it that I'm not actually going to put anything inside of, so I'm not going to name it. The player on the right-hand side, that's going to take up as much room as it needs to. And then the list on the left is going to be at minimum 200 pixels, but up to 1.5 of the fractional space available. The dead zone is going to be half of the fractional space, so I leave a little bit of gap between my video list and my video player. And then on the right-hand side, it's just more of the same. The video player has got to be at least 250 pixels wide, up to 2.5 times the available space. Everything else in here is me getting really freaky with perspective. So I'm transforming, translating, rotating. I'm making the actual list itself bigger than the viewport. So if I look in here at all the places where I'm using VH units, notice the video list is 130% of the viewport height. That's why it's stretching off the top and stretching off the bottom. Still grid, still using grid to put everything where it belongs, but then taking those things, moving them, twisting them, and stretching them wherever I want them to go. This is arguably the most complicated part of the entire example, and I say that because I don't understand it. I found it, and it worked. It makes the cool holes on the side of the film strip, and if you understand it, you're better than I am. All right, let's bring it home. Last little bit. I talked about perspective and how you can do all sorts of really cool things with grid. So it seems weird that I would go back to like the most boring grid possible, just a chessboard. It's not just a chessboard. In the same way that individual grid items can be perspectived and transformed and translated and all that, you're not limited to the grid itself being this flat thing on your screen. So this chessboard actually flip around. I wish my microphone would keep working. I can put it back to where it started. Rotate it. So the reason I'm showing this to you is because I want you to realize rectangular areas aren't really as limiting as it might first sound. Because you can take and turn your grid around, turn things sideways, tilt, shift, pan, whatever you want to do. And when you combine that with things like the ability to do animation of grid gap, you can go from chessboard to dance floor. Moral of the story, grid is 19 kinds of awesome. You want it in your life. If you've experimented with grid before, but you've stuck to like the spans and the rows and the columns, things like that, and thought, well, this is good, but I don't get what all the hype is about, hopefully I've convinced you that there is more here to look at. I wish we'd gotten a chance to do a couple more workshops because I did want you to get a chance to build one of these full viewport things. But they're there. All the workshops are out there, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and all of the examples that we've looked at, as well as a handful of examples that we didn't get to. So please, play with it. Take a look. Really explore it. There is a lot to love here. Last thing, I've given you some resources. There are some names that will keep popping up over and over and over again. Jen Simmons, Rachel Andrew are the big ones. They are like the queens of helping people understand how grid works. You should definitely take a look at Jen Simmons' Layout Land video series on YouTube. You should definitely take a look at her labs. I've linked both of them here. And you should just follow what she does. She's on the CSS working group. So is Rachel. They do amazing things. Rachel Andrew has Grid by Example and CSS Layout News, which helps you keep abreast of what's going on in CSS, which is really worth keeping up with in the evergreen browser world. Dave Geddes, a name really well known in the Angular community, has CSS Grid Critters. So if you want to learn how to do all this cool stuff in grids with gamification, you totally can do that as well. CSS Tricks, I've probably mentioned a couple of times, has a complete guide to grid that's a cheat sheet, and then a bunch of articles on CSS Grid as well that are worth reading. And then a handful of other things down here at the bottom. I like to point out to bosses that Can I Use says, yes, we can totally use grid. Look how much support there is for it. So this is worth it. Definitely worth your investment in time and learning. So hope it's been useful. I appreciate everybody's attention. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be around for the remainder of the conference, or you can shoot me an email. Thank you very much.